Brett Smith grew up out west in this magnificent country with its boundless prairies and splendid rivers. His life is steeped in the traditions of this uncontaminated environment, in the chores of great horse and cattle ranches. Brett's fishing hobby has widened his horizons, and he uses his experience on the land to create innovative fly tying techniques. The two great passions of his life can be summed up in a single name, Palomino, a very special kind of horse and an equally special way to tie flies.
Both sides of my family, my mother's family and my father's family, have ranched for over 100 years in Nebraska. And, cowboying, ranching are important to my family. And it's an important part of my heritage. And I hope, I'm glad to see my son is interested in it, and it's entertainment. We don't go all over the country rodeoing or anything like that, but we compete on a local level, and we enjoy it as a family.
Brett, did you call this flying tying technique Palomino because you like Palomino horses?
Yes, that horse worked really well for me. He always worked good, and I thought a lot of the horse, and he was a beautiful horse. And when I sold him, it was a sad day in my life, and I've never forgotten him. And I like the sound of the word Palomino, so that's why I did it.
And you started to participate to rodeo from the age...
I started rodeoing when I was 19 years old.
Oh, 19. But your son started before.
Yes, this is his first year of competition, and he's 8 years old. I've ridden horses and cowboyed and worked on ranches, but I never started rodeoing until I was 19. And, I tried to make a living at it for a number of years, but I wasn't good enough to make a living at it, but I enjoy it.
And your specialty is the rope now?
Yes. I've always roped. I never rode bucking horses or bulls. It never appealed to me, although I like to watch other people do it.
All your life is with this contact to the nature, the horse, the cows, the ranch, the fishing, hunting, and also you are a fireman, so
yes.
Also to protect the community and the wildlife. This is beautiful.
I'm sure there's people that I know there's people that lived a more exciting life than I have by far, but for the average man, I've had a fair amount of excitement in my life. I enjoy that. I like firefighting. It's a dangerous job, and you certainly must be careful.
Yeah.
Things can happen very quickly, and you can be killed or injured. But it's a job that you can have a lot of pride in, too. Not everyone is cut out to be a fireman.
This is the Bighorn River near Fort Smith, Brett's favorite place to go fishing. He tells us he created the Palomino fly tying technique on this stretch of the river running through the Crow Indian Reservation. Brett's favorite technique is using the strike indicator. The Bighorn River is full of rainbow and brown trout that are all great fighters regardless of their size. And especially during the summer, they're very selective. When fishing for them, it's important to choose the right fly and to cast it correctly.
Oh yeah.
His perfect imitations of river insects are made with new, innovative materials, and he casts them with an uncanny ability that reflects great expertise and a profound knowledge of the environment.
Hello, my name is Brett Smith. I'm the innovator of the Palomino style of fly tying. I'd like to welcome you into my home today, and I'm certainly happy to be a part of this video. Hopefully today we'll be able to go over my style of fly tying. As I said, it's the Palomino style of fly tying. One thing that I would like to say about it is that I believe it to be a very easy and simple style of fly tying, and I believe that I have came up with a number of very innovative ways to tie flies for imitations of midges, caddis, and mayflies. For right now, I'd like to go on to the original Palomino. It's a very simple fly. It started out by fishing on the Bighorn, where the midge is a very predominant hatch throughout the year, but especially in the springtime. We had many fish rising and sipping, and they were very difficult to catch. And this led me to start exploring and trying to find new ways and new patterns to use to catch the trout on the Bighorn River. And this is a very simple pattern that I came up with, and it has led to all the following patterns that you'll see throughout the video. The material that I'm going to use today is the Micro Ultra Chenille. It's a Benici product made in Italy. It's perfect for this application. In this case, I'm going to tie a red midge larva. I'm going to use the Micro Ultra Chenille. I'm going to use a dubbing that is made out of muskrat blend. And when I say muskrat blend, it has muskrat dubbing in it, along with red salmo web that is chopped up and used in a coffee mill. The hooks that I prefer to use are the Tiemco 2457s and the 2487s. And the reason behind this is I believe that they have excellent hooking qualities. They're a strong hook and they're sharp, and they allow themselves perfectly to this style of fly tying. We'll go ahead and tie this midge pattern. We're going to be using a number 18 2457, which is the heavy wire version of this hook. It is known as a scud hook or a larva hook. When I attach my thread, I start out directly in back of the eye, and once the thread is wound onto the hook, one of the key elements in tying a Palomino is to never bring your thread past the point of the hook in this region. This allows you to keep from crowding this style of tying. It is essentially the easiest way to tie an extended body fly that there is, that I know of. I just take a short section of the Micro Ultra Chenille, and in this case I'm going to use red. You can choose the color that you require in your area or that you prefer, the hatch that is the heaviest in your region. Again, I want to stress that one of the rules is that the thread never exceeds past the point of the hook. This is a very simple pattern. I'm going to just tie on the micro ultra chenille onto the shank of the hook and trim this off. One tip that I would like to give you is that you can tie what I refer to as blanks, and that is you can leave the extended portion of the body longer, and on the stream, if it's necessary to reduce the size of the body, you can trim it off with your nippers and singe it with the cigarette lighter. Tapering the body, which is important, is done with a butane lighter. This material singes very easily, very quickly. There is no reason to burn this material. I've had many people talk to me about burning the material. If you'll notice, I just touch it and manipulate that material, and I get the desired taper that I require for this pattern. And as I stated, this is a very simple pattern. I have the micro ultra chenille tied on, and now I'm going to just tie or dub the muskrat dubbing on the thread. I just wind the dubbing forward. If you'll notice, there are a lot of guard hairs left in the dubbing, and I never try to remove the guard hairs out of it like you would for an Adams or any other dry fly. I want some of the guard hairs sticking out. I may at times trim them off to reduce their length. And there's the original Palomino. It's a very simple fly, as I stated, but yet is very effective. You can tie these in many different colors. I carry black, red, olive, and brown, and a kind of a dirty cream colored in my box a lot of times. In a lot of midging situations, it's very good.
Hi, I'm Alberto Salvini, a professional fly fisherman, and I'm here with my best friend, Brett Smith, on a bighorn river.
Today it's been very tough, Alberto.
Yeah.
It's an example of a good river that sometimes gets difficult, and that happens everywhere in the world, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Today I'd like to show you a few techniques that work here for me, and I'm sure that they'll work anywhere else in the world as well.
Mm. There are no rides now. What do you want to do when you wait? When you just must to hunting the fish?
Well, about the only thing a person can do is go ahead and blind fish and fish the channels and the seams and fish deep with pupas or nymphs and see if you can bring some fish to the nymph.
Okay. You know very well this river now. You prefer to cast in on a raffle, on a deep pool, or just in a shallow water? What do you do now?
My preference is to try to find some water that is just breaking off from the riffles and it still has a broken surface, but is also starting to get some depth to it as well.
Okay, we can try and prepare our tippet and move on a raffle.
Okay, let's do that. The second fly that I'd like to show you today is the Palomino Midge Pupa. It's very similar to the first fly that we tied. It does have a Zelon wing case. We'll go over the materials for this fly. Again, I used the Tiemco 2457 or the 2487. We're essentially using the same materials. The micro ultra chenille or new dub in medium is what I prefer. Sometimes the application may require the use of the fine new dub for very small midges. We start directly in back of the eye and run your thread back to the point of the hook. Trim off your excess. At this point, I like to trim off a short section of the micro ultra chenille. For this Palomino Midge, I'll go ahead and it's the same application. tie the micro ultra chenille or the new dub, whichever size that you prefer, on, again ending right at the point of the hook. Again, I use the blue portion of the flame just to singe the very tip. At this point, I would like to introduce a material called Zelon. It is distributed by Umpqua Feather Merchants. Same rule, I trap the Zelon on top. Do not try to trap the very ends of the fibers because it becomes a time-consuming process. As far as dubbing goes, I like to use natural dubbings. Try to use black rabbit on this particular pattern, or muskrat if you have black muskrat. This particular case, I'm going to use a synthetic dubbing known as Sparkle Blend. I start winding, and I allow myself plenty of room in back of the eye so when we draw the Zelon over. And at this point, I draw my Zelon forward and capture it with my thread and take 2 turns. I pull this Zelon back with a fairly strong tug to keep everything tight. And pulling the Zelon back out of the way, I whip finish it. Trim my thread. And at this point, I trim the Zelon off. And I just singe that down very lightly. And while it's cooling, I just taper it back. And there you have the finished fly.
Okay, Brett, we are on the river now, and I would like to know how is your leader and tippet?
I start out with a 10-foot leader that is tapered down to 3X. And I just tie that on with a regular nail knot.
Yes.
And at the end of the tippet, on the tapered leader, I connect another section of 3X material, approximately 18 inches.
Why you put only 18 inches?
Well, because I'm going to tie my lead fly on, and generally I use a large fly,
yes.
Meaning large on the Bighorn River, a 16 or a 14. I'm going to tie that on as my lead fly, and occasionally I will then, from the bend of the large nymph, I will tie another 18-inch tippet section to a smaller fly. For example, maybe a size 14 scud or sowbug would be my lead fly, and my dropper fly would be, say, a Palomino Midge size 20 or 18. And the reason behind tying this section of 3X on is that it gives me some place to anchor my weights. That weight may vary with the depth and the flow of the river. It may be a micro shot, or it may be a B or a size BB.
You can tie your tippet. I think the people is very interested about this tippet.
I just use a regular blood knot because it's easy to tie in low light conditions, and it's a very quick knot to tie, and it seems to be plenty strong.
Yes.
It's actually a modified version of the blood knot, as opposed to bringing the strands 2 different directions.
And cross.
And across, I just pull a small loop and run both tags through it. Before I cinch it down, I wet it.
Yeah.
And trim
Very
the tags.
important wet then.
Yes, very important. If you don't wet it, it can cut the leader and
Yes.
the tippet, as you know. With these Caddis coming off, I'm going to go ahead and use a Caddis pupa as my lead fly. And again, I just tie the regular clinch knot.
Clinch knot is the best always.
and trim the tag. And then to the bend of the hook,
Yeah.
I will attach a section of 5X. Sometimes you may have to go to 6X or 7X, depending on the situation and how the fish are going to respond to your fly.
Mm-hmm.
But in this situation, a 5X tippet will be adequate. Again, the clinch knot.
Okay.
And
More 80.
approximately 18. Some people run them very long, but I've found that I have better success casting, fewer tangles when the situation is windy, and also nymphing. People have a tendency to throw a tailing loop, and this,
Oh, yes.
and it creates a wind knot. And today, I'm just going to run a smaller pupa, a size 16. So I actually am covering two hatches. I'm covering the tan caddis hatch and the black caddis hatch. It is a little early for the tans, but earlier today I caught a couple fish on the tan pupa. And then remember, I have my knot right here where I joined the two sections of 3X.
You put a split?
I will put a split there, and it will vary from water depth as to the amount of weight that you use.
You can change the longer or deeper if you change flies and
Yes, yes. It's a very easy system to change. And the indicators that I use have a split down them, so it can be removed very quickly if the situation changes, or if you start getting some adults rising and you want to fish a dry fly. The system can be broken down very quickly.
Okay.
And that is important. I just slide the indicator on, and it comes with a toothpick. If you leave that long section, it will twist.
Problem. Yeah, twist.
So with my hemostaps, I just crush it and twist and remove that. And we're ready to go fish.
Very good.
The next pattern that I'd like to tie is a Midge Cripple. There's many instances when the emerging Midge pupa gets into the surface film. There's difficulties with the emergence, and they become trapped in the process of emerging in the surface film. Thus, they become very easy prey for trout. And trout become somewhat selective in certain situations looking for a cripple. And this can be a very effective pattern in those difficult times when fish are very, very selective. On this particular pattern, I'm going to be using the 2487, which is the light wire version of the 2457 hook. This allows you to create a nice light dry fly. The technique for tying the palominos is essentially the same for all of them. These are just variations that a person can use to catch fish in different stages. For this particular pattern, I'm going to be using new dub medium size in an olive. I attach the new dub as I did in the other patterns. And trim this off. Again, I use the blue portion of the flame just to singe the very tip. The first several steps are essentially the same as if you were going to tie the Palomino Midge pupa. The Z-lon is attached, and in this instance I'm going to use a olive rabbit highlighted with olive salmo web. There will be a slight difference in the size of the thorax on this particular pattern. I will reduce the size of the thorax somewhat. Once I've drawn the Z-lon over, I turn the fly towards me so the wraps go on very evenly, and after 5 or 6 wraps, I anchor my thread around the eye of the hook. Leave yourself enough space up there that you can work. Once that is done, you can see that the parachute is essentially made, and secure it down with several wraps, allowing yourself plenty of room in back of the eye of the hook. And at this point, I trim the Z-lon off. When choosing a hackle, you can use a hackle gauge if you prefer to. I'd like to just go through the neck and find a hackle that I believe to be just right for what I'm going to do. I have a tendency to over hackle or oversize the hackles on my flies because I like the parachute, but I also am looking for a little bit more flotation. Another tip that I'd like to share with you is when you tie a parachute, I use a material called Zap-A-Gap. I just place a drop of that material right on the thread that I've wound around. Then I take a straight pin and make sure that all of the thread is covered with the Zap-A-Gap material. This reinforces the parachute base, allowing you to have a very stable surface in which to connect and wind your hackle around. I tie the hackle in so the convex side is up. Some of the things that I do in tying flies are somewhat unorthodox, and if you read the books, they say don't do things such as many people tie in the hackle at the top of the parachute and wind the hackle down. I wind my hackle up the parachute stem and back down through it, so it is actually double hackled. It takes premium hackle to do this. If you have poor hackle, you obviously are going to have a poor fly. I like to use the electrical clip for a hackle plier. Once I start winding the hackle on, I wind it to the top of where my thread ended and start back down through it, where I have already wound my hackles. I work back and secure the hackle in back. Draw the hackle forward and take several wraps to secure. And whip finish it. I draw the remaining piece of hackle, the tip of it forward, and trim it off. And at this point, you can trim the parachute to the desired length that you require. Obviously, the higher that you leave it, the easier it is to see, but also you don't want to leave it too high because then you have the problem of causing the fly to turn on the leader. And now we have what I believe to be a very good representation of a cripple. The next fly that I would like to tie finishes out the Midge series in the Palominos. This is the Midge adult dry fly. Very simple dry fly to tie and very durable and also very effective. Again, I'm going to be using the 2487 light wire hook in a size 18. Again, this is a fly that you can tie at home and customize on the stream side for the length of the abdomen. The new dub is tied in just as exactly as though you were going to tie the Pupa or any of the other Palomino midges. I leave a little bit of length on that abdomen so I can adjust that at a later time. Obviously, at this point, it is too long for a Midge adult. I'm going to be tying a parachute style. When I tie the parachute for the adult, I double my Z-Lon material. This allows me to build a good base for the parachute to wind the hackle on. I like to trim this at a 45-degree angle, taking two separate snips on each side. This allows the fly to taper. If you cut it off square, you have then build up a shoulder or a hump that you must fill up with dubbing, and this adds to the weight of the fly. When you trim it at that angle, you eliminate excess material. Again, a secret that I like to use on my parachutes is to turn this fly so it is facing towards me. When I tie the parachute, this allows me to turn my bobbin in that manner as opposed to trying to hold it and hold your elbow up and the material slipping off just as that. That is why I like to turn the fly out to the side. Whether you're right or left-handed, it makes no difference. Turn it so that you are comfortable in making your wraps around the parachute. Again, I like to make the parachute a little more solid. The base is a little more durable when you use the Zap-A-Gap. In this instance, we're going to use the same dubbing that we did on the olive Cripple. Just a very fine application of the rabbit dubbing. Once the dubbing is applied, I leave the section between the parachute and the eye open. There is no dubbing in between it. This allows you to finish off the fly in a very easy fashion. Again, my personal preference is to select a hackle that some may believe to be a little too long or too big for this particular fly, but I like these flies to be able to float and be durable, and I feel that there is absolutely no compromise when you over hackle as long as you keep that in reason. I tie the hackle in with the convex side up. And again, if you have zap-a-gap on your post, it makes it more durable and sturdy. Also, if you can wind this hackle on before the zap-a-gap has a chance to dry, this also adds to the durability of this fly. I sweep the hackles back with my fingers, so I'm careful not to trap any of the barbules in there. I like to trim my parachutes at a 45, roughly, 45-degree angle. I'll trim the length. And remember, when you're singeing these flies that have hackles on them, take care to cover up the fly with your index finger. As you can see, this is a very simple dry fly. It is also very durable.
Now you can show me your casting in this pool.
Okay.
And tell me, what do you prefer when you test the water?
In this situation, I want to cast at a 45-degree angle upstream of the river. And I'll let that drift until it gets very near me, and at that point I will mend my line in back of the indicator without trying to move the indicator. Because if you move the indicator, you pick up the flies. Very important to not lose any of your depth that you've acquired.
Just one or two back casts now, because it's too difficult to to make more false casting when it's two-way. Oh, it is well buttoned.
I try to load my rod in no more than two back casts. Because you've got to be careful of not putting fish down.
Yeah.
And as the indicator goes by me, I play line out because I have a pupa on and I can allow it to swing up.
Yeah.
And you must be ready to feed line when the fish strike below you, because they can snap your tippet very easily. And I load my rod with, oh, that was it.
Was it strike?
Yes.
When you can recognize the strike down the bottom?
I'm trying to feel for the strike. I try to feel the strike before I see it. And I stay in contact with my flies with not only my eyes, but with my fingers as well.
Oh, yes. From here. Okay. Nice, nice.
Sometimes when you have a false strike, you just pick up and let it drift on back down below you.
And mending, go down.
Mending and mending. Just try to keep the fly going the same speed as the current below you.
Oh, yes. At the hand, you try to move a little
At the
bit
end,
up.
I
the
just
Pupa and the Caddis.
just a lasering lift.
Yes. like the real insect.
Yes,
When they
yes.
leave the
Just
button or the stone or
right,
hatches
right.
and come or hatch.
The only thing about when you let a fly go below you in a river like the Bighorn, you have a tendency to pick up moss and grass, but you know, many times it's worth it because you'll catch a number of fish below you. The next fly that I'd like to tie is the Palomino. It's an extended body fly, but it also has tails that are built in the internal portion of the abdomen. This idea was come about by I went to a speaking engagement and showed my Palomino dry flies, and they had no tails in them, and I was very proud of them. And a gentleman said to me, they're nice flies, but they don't have tails in them, and that's important. Well, I had caught a lot of fish on the Palominos with no tails, but there was something that the fishermen, you must also catch them too. And a number of people wanted to see tails in these Palomino dry flies. And it took me a while, but I eventually came up with a system to build the Palomino with the tails. It's essentially very easy. I use a very long and slender needle that is used in the beadwork applications. These are available in many craft stores. I place the needle in the vise. Then I take a section of micro ultra chenille. In this instance, we'll be using yellow for a P.M.D. imitation. This material has a core in it, and we're going to just slide this material onto the needle. If you notice, I'm working with the shorter section, and the reason is as you slide this material onto the needle, you must also spin it, and it is very important that you keep the needle heading directly up the core of this material. Brute force will only run the needle out the side of the material, so it is a delicate process to start it onto the needle. But once the needle has started into the material, it is very easy to slide it up onto the needle. You can check it, the distance, how far you have slid up on the needle by bending your micro ultra chenille. Once you have aligned it, release the needle from the vise and slide it down and slide the material up the needle. You remove it from the vise and slide the material very near the eye of the needle. At this point, we're going to take the lighter and put our taper in the abdomen. Remember, it's important to use the blue portion of the flame, especially on the light colors, due to the carbon from the lighter. And I just tease it with the flame, thus I get the taper that I desire. At that point, I place the needle back into the vise, and if you're like me, my eyesight is poor, I have to turn the needle so I can see the eye of the needle, because I'm going to have to line up to place the microfibbits through the eye of the needle. At this point, we're going to use a material known as microfibbits. They essentially look like a paintbrush without a handle. I like to select 3 or 4. Any more than that, and I feel that you will have too many tails and it will look unnatural. I clip them off even, and they're tapered to a point on one end and square on the other where you cut them off. I stick the microfibbits in my mouth to moisten them so all of the material is lined up and easy to get through the eye of the needle. Sometimes it's very difficult to see the eye of the needle, and when you get my kind of eyesight, it requires a little bit of assistance. Once the microfibrils are through the eye of the needle, you slide the abdomen forward. This next step is very important. The abdomen is now sliding up onto the microfibrils and off of the needle. You must place the spot of zap-a-gap exactly where you want the tails to end. Because once the micro-ultra chenille runs into the microfibrils with the zap-a-gap, it is going to bond. You have a second where you can split the tails to make them more realistic. And you now have completed the abdomen with the tail in it. And at this point, you trim off the microfibrils, remove the needle from your vise, and carefully set your abdomen to the side. Again, we're going to use the 2487. It's a light wire hook for the dry fly. At this time, we'll take the abdomen and judge it and determine the length in which we want. Tie the abdomen on. This particular dry fly, we're going to tie a parachute. So I take the Z-Lon, and again, it is doubled. That allows us to have a very solid base in which to spin our hackles on. Remember how I stated earlier, you want to trim at a 45-degree angle, and this allows you to have a nice taper. I bring my thread forward to help the Z-Lon start to stand up a little bit. I take a couple of wraps to get it straightened out, and I wind it. About 5 or 6 wraps allows you to head up the Z-Lon material to start the base. Take a couple anchor turns around the shank of the hook. After 5 or 6 turns around the Z-Lon, and this stops it from unwinding, or if it does unwind, you do not lose your entire post. Inspect the fly at this time to make sure that everything is in proportion. And I like to readjust my fly the angle of the shank of the hook. I like to use super fine dubbing on a lot of my dry flies. It's very fine and easy to work with. A very light application on the thread. Again, I like to select a hackle that is somewhat larger than what the standard size would be for a size 18 dry fly. We'll tie in the hackle that has been gauged, convex side up, as we did in the Midge adult and the Midge Cripple. You can secure your post with a very small drop of zap-a-gap. Also, with the Zap-A-Gap still being wet, this allows you, when you turn your hackles on, they will also glue. It will have no effect on their performance. But it just adds to the durability of the fly. Pull the barbules out of the way. Take several turns before you release your hackle pliers. Again, do not trim the tip of that hackle until the fly is completed, should things become unsecure. You must remember that these materials are working for you, and you are not working for the materials. Adjust them and manipulate them how you need them to work. Many fly tyers allow the materials to dictate to them what they are going to do. I don't believe in that. I believe in manipulating the materials and making them work for me. Again, I'm going to trim the post at roughly a 45-degree angle, and we have a completed extended body Palomino dry fly with the internal tails.
When you think you must change your weight, less or more, when you have a feeling that a good weight is working well in this pool or in another pool?
Generally, that is a trial and error. As you fish throughout the day, you can feel many times that weight on the bottom. And as it bounces along, you feel it tick across the bottom, like that was that was the bottom.
Yes.
And I just offer a strike because it may be a fish, and now I feed line to it going down.
Oh, there we go. Nice try.
Oh!
That's good.
See, a lot of times when you strike fish down below you,
Yeah.
they're picking it up as the fly is moving away.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a solid hook. It's not uncommon to lose them below you. The pattern that I'm going to tie now is the Ovopositing female Caddis, black Caddis. This pattern will have the female with the egg sac on the back of her abdomen. This is a very simple process. It's a very good fly. It works real well for me on the Bighorn River, and it's an interesting story with the materials. The egg sac is made out of tulip pearl, which is a fabric paint that you can buy in nearly any craft store, and it comes in a wide variety of colors and is easily used, and if allowed to dry for 24 hours, it is not water soluble, and it lasts for many fish. In fact, you'll more than likely lose the fly before you'll have any problem with the tulip pearl coming off. I also use the floatant chenille from Benici products for the abdomen of this fly. If you wish to have a smaller version of this fly, you can also use the micro ultra chenille in place of the floatant chenille. I'll go ahead and use the same hook that I do for my other Palominos, which is a 2457 or a 2487 in this case, because we're making a dry fly. A little bit of background on this material here. The first step that you're going to have to make in preparation for this is is to singe the taper of the body. And again, you want to use the blue portion of the flame. You singe it slightly. And then you apply the tulip pearl just to the very end of the abdomen. And try to keep it in a ball if you can, as opposed to just dyeing the end of the fly green. The material does not shrink down when it dries. It stays essentially the same size as when you apply it. It's easily applied and it dries rather quickly. It can dry in 10 minutes. It'll be dry enough to use. Again, I attach my thread right in back of the eye of the hook and go to the point. I want to emphasize the importance of that. Once you have the abdomen tied on, you must build up a portion of the thorax. I use black superfine dubbing for this, and I allow myself a lot of room up here because I have to stack this elk hair to make an elk hair wing. Many times tyers use a stacker to stack the hair, but I prefer not to a lot of times. I just line it up in my hands. You see very few caddis in nature that have perfectly aligned wings. So a little rugged look does not hurt the fly. Attach it just so the wing ends right in front of the egg sac. In addition to the elk hair on the wing, I'm going to fill in a portion of the elk hair with black salmo web. We used this material earlier in the video with the application of mixing it in rabbit hair or muskrat hair for dubbing. This time I'm going to apply it in addition to my wing. I take a swatch, and you want to use approximately half of the density that you want in the wing because it is going to be doubled over. I tie it in on top and fan it around, and again, make these materials work for you. Do not work for the material, make it work for you. And I tie that down on there. And once I have the material secured, I'm going to lift it back up and away, and making very carefully to make sure that you don't pick up any of your hair with it. And you take your shears and squeeze and rake them back and forth through the material. And this gives an uneven effect, and you don't want to come in and just chop that off square. You want to kind of rake it through the hair and work it back. Leave a few sprigs going here and there. It adds to the effect of the wing. This gives a lot of sheen to the wing, and also it is waterproof, so it certainly doesn't absorb any water. Then we must come in here with some black superfine dubbing, just a very small bit, to build up the shoulder region and the head of the caddis. Now, something I do that they say not to do in many books is to start your dubbing at the eye and dub back and then wind through it. They say not to do that. I break that rule here. I'm tying the fly, so I can do that if I want to. And that completes the fly. The next fly that I would like to tie is a cased caddis, and this is, again, is a Palomino style fly. This is a stage of flies that I feel a lot of times is ignored by fly fishermen. Maybe it's because they just don't think of cased caddis as being a large food source, but in one of the local streams near my home, cased caddises are a huge portion of the trout's diet, and it is very important, and this has allowed me to work this pattern up, and it has been a very successful pattern for me in my personal use. I start out with the floatant chenille, and what I apply more heat than usual to the floatant chenille in comparison to the other Palominos. I want to try to cook that chenille down without making the material curl around. And when you look at a cased caddis, the end is squared off. And you just trim that until you're satisfied with the length of the case. And once that is completed, you use the 2457 hook, the heavy wire style. You can adjust the size of your case in accordance with how much of the insect that you want coming out of the case. Obviously, some of them will look just like this piece of chenille here when they're attached to the rock or something like that. But the phase that I want to try to capture is just the emergence of the caddis coming out of the case. The next step that we're going to do, we're going to use some black salmo web just to kind of fill in the area and build up the head of the case. And we do this by just taking a clump of salmo web and laying it on there on the shank of the hook, turning it around, building the area up just a little bit. This material is then pulled forward and clipped off, just in a very small brush style. Make sure that you clean all of the salmo web out from around the hook. Then I use the Caddis green superfine dubbing just as a representation of the caddis abdomen starting to emerge out of the case. And again, this is a pattern that you can adjust to your local waters and your caddis hatches by the color variations that you want to use. Then we have to come in here with some partridge for a representation of the legs that would be folded back underneath the belly region. It does not take a lot of partridge, just a small representation of the legs. When you trim, you don't have to be exact because we're going to be covering this area up with the next material, which is going to be, in this case, dyed black pheasant tail. I strip a section out of that until I can find the length that I want, and I use approximately 6 to 8 barbules together. You tie them in on top of the hook shank, winding your thread back, and drive those thread wraps into the abdomen region. Once that's completed, I will take Zap-A-Gap and put a small coat of Zap-A-Gap over the thread wraps. This adds durability to the pheasant barbules, who have a tendency to be a fragile material. I wind them forward to the eye of the hook. You only need a couple winds of thread around the barbules. Trim them off. And whip finish. I'm fishing a long ways away from myself, probably 40 feet away. So my strike has got to be fairly strong.
You try a spot like an arc and move up or move down, no? Every few casting.
I nymph fish like a dry fly fisherman handles a stretch of water. I prefer to fish it moving upstream.
Upstream, okay.
And unless I have a very deep pool that takes a lot of cast to cover well,
yeah.
I prefer to nymph just as though you would a dry fly. Moss.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of information on strike indicators and a lot of arguments pro and con. My feeling on strike indicators is that is just this, that a strike indicator, if it assists somebody in catching a fish that's having trouble, that's very good. You know, the whole idea is to come out and catch some fish and have some fun. You know, I can catch these fish without an indicator, probably about as easy as I can with an indicator. The only difference being is when I use an indicator, I can make my cast and mend, and it allows me to look up and away from what I'm doing to enjoy the country that I'm in, and take in some of the sights and enjoy the surroundings a little bit.
Definitely.
And look back and still see my flies and what's taking place. The next fly that I'd like to tie for you is the Palomino Emergent diving caddis. This fly has worked very well for me for a number of years on the Bighorn River, and just everywhere that I have been and had the opportunity to fish a caddis pattern. This fly seems to be very successful, and it's very easy to tie. And some of the materials that we're going to be using are the floatant chenille in a buckskinish tan, and we're also going to be using some bleached deer hair. I like to use Texas whitetail because of the lack of underfur in it. a material called salmo web in golden olive, and this is a fly that I think that you'll find when you start using it, you'll have very good success with it. I attach the thread as I do on all Palominos, bringing the thread back to the eye of the hook. It's very important when you make the body of a caddis that you don't get the body abdomen tapered too tight, because they have a tendency to have a chubby cigar-shaped body. And again, you use the blue portion of your flame to manipulate the material. And you have a more rounded abdomen. Tie that on the shank of your hook, ending your thread at the point, and continue to tie down the material. At this point, I like to use a 10 dubbing, natural. This particular dubbing is from a red fox squirrel belly. Very easy to dub. Build the abdomen portion up. One tip that I would like to give you is to leave this thorax area squared off as much as possible. This helps your deer hair flare and builds that shoulder that you need on a caddis. Again, I don't use a hair stacker for my hair. I like it to be somewhat uneven. I lift the hair up with my shears and trim off a section, and I use my fingers to even it up, cleaning out what little underfur there is in that Texas whitetail. Now on the emergent diver, it's very important that the wing be shorter than the abdomen. About 2/3 to 3/4 the length of the abdomen, the wing should be. And this is the step where if you do not drive your thread all the way to the thorax, you will roll that deer hair. And that is a good guide to tell you whether you are as tight as you need to be. Now we're going to add the golden olive, which is actually more yellow than anything, to the wing. This will give the fly some highlight and some sheen. And we're going to leave kind of a rugged, untrimmed effect with the salmo web. Again, we pick this up, pick up the salmo web, and scrape into the material as you close your shears. You don't want it to be squared off. You want some salmo web material uneven and trailing behind it. I believe that this adds to the life of this fly and the effectiveness of this fly. Once that step has been completed, I use a synthetic dubbing that is slightly darker than the rest of the fly for the head. Not a real dark brown, but obviously a little darker than the yellow and the buckskin color. And again, I start my dubbing in back of the eye, and I wind it back to the wing and bring my thread wraps through the dubbing back to the eye. Whip finish, and the fly is complete. Caddis pupa. It's very, very effective. I tie it in olive, in brown, and in a black caddis. When you make a good cast,
Yes.
and you know that you have a good drift taking place, and you follow it all the way through,
Yes.
and no strike occurs, and it's prime water, at that time you may want to.
Oh, it was a nice fish, this one.
It was a nice fish, but once again he was down below us in a downstream strike.
Yes.
You must keep the pressure on them. That's why when they jump or they run to you, they're very difficult to keep on.
Very, very quickly.
But as I was saying, when you have a good drift taking place and nothing hits, then that is a good time to check your flies to make sure that they're not fouled in some way, either by moss or grass, or maybe you've even lost the fly.
Or maybe change another fly.
Or change the fly.
Yeah.
And I try to pick out the currents and the seams across, and I try to put my fly in the rapid part of the seams, and keep my indicator in the calmer sections. This fly that I'm going to tie for you is Smith's Bead Body Caddis. It's a very, very effective fly when you intend to fish deep. It is a good pupa representation. I'm going to incorporate some new material that is out from Giorgio Bonici's. It is a crystal flash version of Nudub, and it has tremendous amounts of highlights and light gathering properties. I've found it to be very effective on this Smith's Bead Caddis. I'm going to use a silver bead, and I do some things different on this pattern than what a lot of people do on these bead caddises. A lot of people are sliding the bead forward to the eye of the hook. I am putting the bead about a third of the way back down the shank on the hook, and this makes the fly ride in more of a natural pupa position through the water. I think that it's important, and it's been very effective for me. I used the 2457 along in conjunction with the silver bead. I tie my thread in back of the bead, and I go past the point of the hook. Down to just the curve in the shank. At this point, I tie in the crystal Nudub. And wind the Nudub around the shank of the hook. At this point, I'll measure with my bead to make sure that I have enough room in front to complete my air bubble and my leg and wing representation. I like to leave a small piece sticking up while I measure this in case I have to back something off or some material slips. I whip finish this down and then slide the bead back. Instead of snipping my thread off and going forward and starting over, I just whip finish in front of the bead a number of times. And now I'm ready to use the salmo web to create the air bubble around the pupa. In this case, I'm going to use the blue dun. And I would like to remind you that I use half of the material that I actually need because I'm going to be folding it back. I place the material on top of the hook shank and I'll be tying it down in front of the bead. I secure it with a couple loose wraps and I roughly divide it in the middle in a V shape. The idea behind this is when I push this back, it will form that tear shape that is desired in these pupas. Driving the salmo web back into the bead causes the salmo web to flare, and this helps create that tear shape. When I'm ready to trim this salmo web, do not square it off. Stick your shears behind there, behind the body, and slowly close them and grate them back and forth, and you get an uneven trim which helps create the point on the teardrop. The next step is to take a black hen hackle I like to use a section that's roughly half the length of my salmo web that I've tied in. We only need a couple turns in front of this bead. And this is our leg representation on the pupa. Now I'm going to take some black superfine dubbing, just a very small amount because my thread is also black, just enough to create a head and shoulder representation. Again, I like to start right in back of the eye of the hook and drive my dubbing back to the bead. This also, you want to sweep your salmo web and your hen hackle backwards, back towards the tail of the fly, and then bring your thread forward through the dubbing. At this point, check and make sure that you have no long pieces of salmo web, and you have the finished fly. This fly I call the Invidious Crowder. I like this fly because it takes some properties from a couple different flies. The abdomen will be made out of copper wire, like on the brassy, and it has the bead, brass bead on it, and the salmo web and partridge. This fly, you know, uses a number of materials that work very well on various other flies, and I think that when they're combined together, they make a very effective caddis pupa that is simple to tie. I connect my thread in back of the bead and run my thread wraps down to the curve in the hook. At that time, I used the large sized copper wire. I wind the thread down to the bend of the hook, and at this point I take several wraps to make sure that the copper wire won't slide forward on me. And I start my wraps forward, keeping them close and tight together. And occasionally measure with your bead when you get near to the point. That puts the bead about 1/3 of the way back on from the eye of the hook. Take numerous wraps in this area to secure the copper wire. Again, I like to whip finish my thread before moving it forward in front of the bead. At this point, I'm going to use white salmo web for the halo effect of the air bubble on the pupa. Use approximately half of the material that you think that you will need, because you're going to double this material back to form the air bubble on the pupa. Tie it in approximately 1/2 extending forward. Take several wraps. At this point, I fan the material out, and you must take caution to make sure that you have material on the sides, the bottom, as well as the top. And take your index finger and your thumb and push it back to the bead and tie down the material, driving your thread wraps into the bead. At this time, pull the material not too tight, but with a little tension, and as you close your shears, grate them back and forth, cutting the salmo web in an uneven fashion. This helps create the teardrop effect that we're looking for. Once that is in place, I use either partridge or brown hen saddle, and I'm going to just tie in 2 sections that represent the wings and the legs of this pupa. One section will be tied away from you on the shank of the hook, and when you've reached the bead, stop there and pull off the other section from the same feather. Form a cluster and face those towards you, and take several winds and head towards the eye of the hook. Once that is in place, trim the excess feather material from away from the eye. And tie that material down, leaving your thread directly in back of the eye of the hook. At this point, I use a medium brown super fine dubbing to form the head. Starting at the eye and winding your dubbing back to the bead, and then wind your thread back through the dubbing to the eye. And whip finish. Yeah, this, I don't think he's that big,
No,
but
the brown.
he's
Medium size.
he's pretty strong. I'll get him on the reel here. I like to get him on the reel as quick as I can.
Yeah.
Oh, unless we've picked up some moss, he's a lot better than I thought. I like to have him below me.
Yes.
I'll pick his head up. Oh, he's a small one.
Really small.
Very small. He picked up the larva.
The drafter.
No, he picked up the.
Yeah. Oh.
He picked up the larva.
Wet the hand. Just move on the face on the current and go. Thank you, fish.
At this time, I would like to tie my green drake nymph. It's an extended body with an internal tail. I've had tremendous success with this fly in numerous creeks up in the Bighorn Mountains. I'm positive that it would be an excellent imitation anywhere where there are green drakes present in a watershed. This is a very simple pattern to tie, in my opinion, and I know for a fact that it is very effective. I use the floatant chenille. We want to manipulate this this with the butane lighter, and I want to stress that we want to use the blue portion of the flame. It's much cleaner, it leaves no carbon, and it's the hottest portion of the flame. And that's how we manipulate this material to get the desired taper and effect that we want. Allow yourself plenty of material. Once this has been singed, you have to slightly trim the end of it to open that singed end up and expose the core of this material. As I stated, you want to allow yourself plenty of room. This will be plenty long for the pattern that we're going to tie today. You want to get you some beading needles. These needles are used for the craft of beading. Place the needle in the vise with the point down. And having trimmed the end of this chenille and having singed it, we will now just run the needle right down the core of this material. Just start it in the middle of the core and push and twist at the same time. And the needle should not have a problem finding and tracking the core. If the needle pops out the side, obviously you've missed the core. To check the length in which it is on the needle, just fold the material down, straighten it back out, and twist and push at the same time. Thus, the material slides up the needle. Adjust your needle in the vise. And slide it up to very close to the eye of the needle. Once it's to that point, you have to place the needle in the vise, rotate it to where you can see, have a good angle on the eye, because we're going to take these microfibrils. If you're not familiar with them, they're similar to a paintbrush, tapered on one end, and when you cut them off at the other end, they're going to be squared. We're going to run the tapered end through the eye of the needle. Moisten them in your mouth, using the light to help you out. Thread the microfibrils right through the eye of the needle. Having done that, you slide the abdomen up onto the microfibrils. A very important step is to use this Zap-A-Gap, and this is going to adhere the microfibrils into the abdomen. You place a drop of Zap-A-Gap exactly where you want the abdomen to end and the tail to begin. And this length is certainly up to you. It's your preference. And you have a few seconds there where you can divide out the tails and fan them out before the Zap-A-Gap dries. Once you've completed that, you now have the abdomen portion of this fly completed. We'll set that to the side and remove our needle. Place it in a safe place. These needles bend relatively easy. There's a lot of flex to them. They're easy to work with. They'll break before they'll ever get any bend into them. They have a lot of give. We'll use the TMC 2457. This is going to be a Nymph, obviously, so we can use the heavy wire hook. I start my thread in back of the eye and I run the thread to the point of the hook, never past it. That's just a good rule of thumb to use on tying the Palomino style of tying. We have plenty of abdomen to work with, and it'll be up to you to gauge the length of abdomen that you want. Secure it on top of the shank and trim any excess that is there. Take a small portion of dubbing, olive in this case because we're tying a green drake, and just build up a small section right in there to help create the taper where the abdomen is tied onto the shank. At this point, we'll use Zelon for our wing case on this nymph. I'll square it up with my shears, place it on the shank of the hook, and tie it down, allowing myself plenty of room at the eye. At this point, I'm going to use the Dubbit tool, which is an excellent tool for dubbing loops and spinning hair or fur or even synthetics. I've found that if I keep my loop relatively small, it's a lot easier to control the materials. And you put your materials in the dubbing loop in a perpendicular fashion, and it certainly is a lot easier to control. This particular dubbing has olive salmo web used to highlight the olive rabbit. And having placed it into the dubbing loop, I line everything up in the loop and start spinning the tool. Once I've spun the material on in the loop, I take my shears and just kind of use the back of them to rake and fluff up the material and pick out any loose material that's still there. I take an electrical clip and wind my thread around it and clip it down. And now I don't have to fight this tool around my bobbin. I have a very handy dubbing rope that I've created. And I make a few turns, and each turn I stroke the hair back out of the way, and this will help create a nice leg effect on the nymph, allowing myself plenty of room at the eye. And I take a few turns over the remaining thread. And press down on the thorax and divide it with the Zelon, drawing it forward tight. A couple turns over it, pull it back. Several turns in back of the eye. Whip finish it. And I've trimmed off the Zelon, and I fan out material to the side. Rolling the fly onto its back, exposing the belly, and trimming flat across the belly. and we have the completed green drake nymph. The first step that we're going to do is trim a piece of the liqui lace a little bit longer than what will be necessary. Secondly, we'll take a piece of marabou and pull all the quills on one side into a bunch. And wet one end and twist just a little bit, and that keeps them from becoming unruly. Then we clear the other side in the same fashion, making sure that we don't accidentally cut the stem. Now once I've trimmed that marabou away from the stem, I'll go ahead and strip the stem clean and trim off the bottom of it. At this point, we'll take the liqui lace and cut it at a slight angle. This helps us later on in developing the taper. The quill is then slid down through the liqui lace. Just continue to push it on down at this point. Take some care to make sure that you don't snap off the quill. And pull the fibers to the desired length. At that time you can then trim that. I always leave a little section there, and that is a safety, so the quill does not get removed. The next step, once the abdomen has been made, is to secure your thread and attach your eyes. These eyes are very handy. There's various methods of making eyes. I just find these particularly easy because they're already processed and it saves time. I allow myself plenty of room up in the eye area of the hook on all of my flies. This makes finishing flies so much easier. At this point, we're going to tie in our abdomen, and I run the abdomen clear to where the eyes are tied in, and this helps build up and give us a little bit of bulk in the thorax region. Once that's been secured and the proportions are to your satisfaction, I take a section of Swiss straw and I allow myself plenty of material. The material is rather inexpensive, so consequently I allow myself plenty of material. And I tie it in where the eyes are tied in, and I travel back on my abdomen where my thread wraps ended. At that point, you have your Swiss straw tied in, and you're ready to use the doublet tool. Bring your thread over to form a loop, and there are many different tools out there for using dubbing loops, but I've learned to use this tool and I enjoy it. So, and I'm very satisfied with the effect that it gives my flies. You want to take great care in placing the marabou. One section that you've trimmed off should be placed to the left. And this is very difficult material to work with. And if possible, get the other section that you trimmed away into the loop with the tips pointing to the right. And start turning your dub it tool, and it spins the marabou. And you will more than likely wind up with more material on the dubbing loop than what it will require to tie the thorax. But it is better to have more material than is necessary. At this point, I transfer the thread onto a electrical clip. And start winding it onto the shank of the hook. There's a lot of material happening here and it's awful fuzzy, but that's okay because we'll come back and we'll hand pick this and clean it up. And I make sure that I crisscross between the eyes and fill up the thorax and the head region. Again, allowing myself plenty of room at the eye of the hook. At this point, I draw the Swiss draw forward to create the top of the head. And I tie down to the eye and draw the material back and form the face. And draw my thread in back of the eyes and take several wraps and whip finish it. And I leave a small wing pad trimmed out of the Swiss draw. At this point, I will trim the belly of the fly very carefully. You don't want to take large bites with your scissors because you may trim away too much material. Care must be given in trimming this fly. The proper term, I guess, would be you want to pluck this fly. And when this marabou gets wet, it fills in and creates the taper along the side of the abdomen. I found it to be a very effective pattern, and it's relatively easy to tie. Whitefish. I would like to thank you for watching this video, and I hope that you've learned some things from my tying experiences. It's certainly been enjoyable for me, and hopefully someday we'll meet on the river and we'll be able to share a few experiences together. Thank you very much.
It was a real pleasure to meet Brett Smith. His roots are here, and he embodies all the virtues of the pioneering Midwest spirit. Brett's very close to his family. His love for the simple traditional values of the American way of life is shared by his wife, Laura. Brett always has a story to tell, and he loves to involve his friends in his zest for life. Thanks to Brett Smith, we discovered a new concept in tying imitations, developed by a man who is not only an expert angler, but also an ingenious, talented fly tyer, Brett Smith.